Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here again, sifting through all that noise to get to the insights that really count. And today we're diving into something, well, it seems technical on the surface, but it's actually deeply about personal responsibility, about ethics. We're talking about Bitcoin nodes.
Right, and you might think, nodes, that's just infrastructure, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's where our deep dive kicks off, because the sources we've looked at really challenge that idea. Okay, so let's dig into this then. When you choose, to run a Bitcoin node,
Yeah.
are you really just like a neutral pipe?
Just passively relaying data.
Yeah, a passive observer just letting information flow across the network? Or do you, as the individual running it, actually bear some genuine active responsibility for the kind of content that passes through and, well, ultimately gets stored on your machine?
It's a fascinating conflict, isn't it?
It really is. Bitcoin stands for decentralization, freedom.
Yeah.
But what happens when that freedom bumps up against potentially harmful, maybe even illegal digital content?
Yeah.
Our sources, they strongly suggest that this idea of absolute neutrality for node operators, it might just be a myth. They blend philosophy with some very practical, even legal urgency.
And that's exactly why this conversation feels so necessary right now. I mean, Bitcoin definitely shook up finance, no question, but its whole decentralized nature, it almost automatically created this new set of really complex questions about accountability, not just for the system itself, but for the individuals, participating in the system.
Right.
So our mission today is really to explore these moral and potentially legal implications for anyone who's part of networks like these. And we'll focus especially on a really key distinction about the type of data being handled.
That's crucial.
It really forces us and you listening to think about the so what. What does it mean for you as an individual participant in this ever-evolving decentralized world? So maybe ask yourself as we go, what does active participation really mean when you're part of a global permissionless network? What stands out to you?
That's a great way to frame it. Because our sources, they jump right into what they see as a basic truth about joining any system, especially one as open as Bitcoin. They're incredibly direct about it. Responsibility isn't something you can just opt out of when you decide to engage.
You can't just sidestep it.
No. And it's not about some outside authority making up rules. They frame it as a fundamental principle of human accountability. Basically, if you run a node, you can't just wash your hands of responsibility for immoral or illegal stuff happening if there are tools or ways you could prevent or filter that content. If you knowingly, or maybe even just negligently, let harmful activity happen through your node, you could be seen as complicit.
And this isn't just theory, right?
Not at all. Our sources really emphasize this has real, practical, and potentially quite serious legal consequences.
That's a vital point. The shift from thinking you're just passively involved to understanding you have active accountability. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that foundational idea is just critical for everything else we're discussing.
Absolutely.
It's not just about what the network allows, but more about what you, the individual participant, are willing to let flow through your machine, and importantly, what you might be able to stop. Think about a hypothetical scenario some sources raise. Imagine your computer running a node is found to have stored some really nasty illegal content embedded in the blockchain.
Right.
Arguing, oh, I was just relaying data, might not cut it. The act of choosing to store the entire unfiltered ledger, especially if filtering tools are available, well, that becomes the sticky point.
Oh.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does this idea of, inescapable personal responsibility sit with how you think about the online platforms you use daily, platforms where usually some central company handles the content moderation, not really individual users like you or me?
It definitely forces a rethink of what passive participation even means online. And this whole discussion about a network's integrity, what it should or shouldn't carry, it's not entirely new in the crypto world, is it?
Not at all.
Our sources bring up a really interesting bit of history here, something that shines a light on Bitcoin's core design thinking and these exact principles. They take us back to the very beginnings of Ethereum.
Oh, right. With Vitalik Buterin.
Exactly. When Vitalik was first hashing out the ideas for Ethereum, he actually proposed changing Bitcoin's data carrier size. He wanted it to handle richer, more complex data, stuff beyond just simple monetary transactions.
But the Bitcoin developers at the time, they were very firm about keeping the network's original, quite narrow scope.
They said no.
They refused. And that refusal, that real dedication to Bitcoin's original design principles, is precisely why Vitalik went off and built Ethereum as a completely separate blockchain.
So what does that refusal tell us?
Well, it poses a significant question. What were those Bitcoin developers trying to prevent? Our sources suggest that by sticking to Bitcoin's strict original design, especially about its data structure, they might have actually dodged what they call Ethereum-like disputes and chaos.
Interesting phrasing.
Think about the headaches Ethereum has faced with smart contracts, like the DAO hack, remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Or the constant arguments about what's valid data or what are legitimate uses for its, much broader capabilities. Bitcoin's early decision to not make it easy to embed and store all sorts of arbitrary non-money data was fundamental.
Foundational choice.
Absolutely. It highlights the risk you run if you compromise those core principles, if you open the door to endless types of data. It wasn't just a tech decision. It seems like it was a deeply ethical one about the network's purpose and its limits right from the start. And arguably, that decision protected Bitcoin's integrity and maybe even saved its users from future headaches related to content liability.
That historical perspective really does set the stage for understanding this key difference, what a network is designed for versus what it could potentially carry, and becomes even sharper when we contrast the normal internet experience, the one we're all familiar with, against the very unique situation of running a Bitcoin node.
That's a great comparison to make.
Think about how we usually go online. We're mostly interacting with curated platforms, right? YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, maybe even just through our internet service provider.
Right, there are intermediaries.
Exactly. These companies have built-in ways to moderate content. They generally take on a fair bit of responsibility for what's hosted or transmitted. Plus, they often benefit from legal shields, like safe harbor protections, which basically means they're protected from liability as long as they try their best to find and remove illegal stuff, like, say, child abuse material, once they know about it.
There's a system, there are expectations.
There's a process, yeah. There are intermediaries' expectations of due diligence.
And that's where the difference with Bitcoin nodes is so stark, maybe even a bit jarring. Running a Bitcoin node, by its very nature, is not curated like that at all.
No.
You're not dealing with some middleman filtering content for you. Nope. You are directly accepting raw, random data from total strangers all over the network. And there's no built-in gatekeepers actively screening for harmful stuff before it lands and gets stored on your computer.
This sounds exposed.
It is. What's fascinating, and maybe a bit unnerving, is that basic lack of a filtering mechanism in the core protocol for anything other than checking if a transaction itself is valid financially. So, unlike those platforms where content might get flagged, reported, removed,
Yeah.
a Bitcoin node operator is in a unique and much more exposed position. It's a fundamentally different kind of challenge compared to the big corporate platforms we use every day.
So you become essentially a direct recipient and like a permanent host for the entire history, every single bit of data that's ever been put on there.
Precisely. The whole unfiltered ledger.
Wow. That really drives home this shift in personal responsibility. Which brings us right to what our sources call the absolute key distinction, and this is really where the rubber meets the road if you're thinking about running a node. It's the huge difference between monetary data and arbitrary data.
This is critical.
Let's start with monetary data. Our sources explain that even if money is used for bad things, human trafficking, terrorism, drugs, whatever, just recording the transaction itself on a neutral financial ledger doesn't automatically make the ledger, or the person running the node, complicit in the crime itself.
Right. Think about banks.
Exactly. A bank isn't held responsible for every single bad purchase made using its debit cards, as long as it follows the rules, like anti-money laundering regs, reporting suspicious stuff.
Standard practice.
Neutral financial networks, like Bitcoin, when it's just used for sending value, are generally seen as legitimate tools. So processing that financial data, who sent how much to whom, that act itself, doesn't really, morally or legally, blame the operator for the reason behind the transaction.
Exactly right. But, and this is the crucial turn, arbitrary data completely changes the game. Responsibility shifts massively here.
Okay, define arbitrary data in this context.
So our sources define arbitrary data as basically any files, images, text, code, non-financial stuff that someone might try to cram onto the Bitcoin network, using it like a data storage system instead of just for payments.
Okay.
And here's the absolute critical point. With arbitrary data, the data itself can be illegal or deeply problematic. It's not just reflecting a bad activity elsewhere.
The data is the problem.
Precisely. Imagine a scenario that some sources describe this vividly, where someone embeds, I don't know, some nasty malware or worse, illegal images like child abuse material directly into the blockchain. Maybe by disguising it cleverly within transaction details, like in unspendable outputs.
Okay, so they hide it within what looks like a transaction.
They can, yes. And now, if your Bitcoin node downloads, processes, and permanently stores that block containing the hidden data, that illicit data is now sitting on your hard drive, inside your digital space.
Oh, so it's not just that the money might be used badly, but the actual content itself, the data being stored on my machine, is the illegal or harmful thing.
That's it, exactly. It is a totally different ballgame.
How would someone even technically hide files like that in a transaction? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, our sources explain that this kind of arbitrary data can be encoded, often in small chunks, within parts of a Bitcoin transaction that aren't meant to be spent, the unspendable outputs, or sometimes using features like op-return. Historically, small bits of data were sometimes used for legitimate things like timestamping.
Right, I've heard of that.
But that same capability can be exploited. So if someone, say, encodes illegal imagery piece by piece across a series of these outputs over time, and your node just downloads and stores those blocks as part of maintaining the ledger, you are then, perhaps completely unknowingly, hosting that illegal content.
Right.
This creates, as the sources stress, a new layer of direct responsibility for node operators. You're suddenly not just facilitating a financial transfer, you are actively possessing and potentially propagating the problematic content itself.
So the whole "I'm just neutral" argument completely falls apart there.
It utterly fails. Because the content itself is immoral or illegal, making the operator directly vulnerable to legal trouble just for having it on their system.
That definitely shifts things from, a philosophical debate to something immediately practical and, frankly, scary. And given that huge risk, our sources aren't just like ringing a philosophical bell. They're sounding what they actually call a practically urgent alarm.
Urgent is the right word.
The speaker really hammers this home. Effective spam filters, ways to actively discriminate against this harmful, arbitrary data, they must exist in the Bitcoin world. Because otherwise, node operators without any bad intention at all could just accidentally end up storing what the source very bluntly calls degenerate filth, and then face direct blame, maybe even serious legal charges. It's not just about the network's image anymore. It's about the personal safety and legal status of every single person running a node.
Absolutely. The consequences of not having or using these filters are severe. This kind of arbitrary data, especially the really illicit kind, it threatens to undermine Bitcoin's entire integrity, its public image as a legitimate financial tool.
Definitely.
And more immediately, it puts every participant at significant legal risk. Our sources contrast this with traditional finance systems where, okay, things can be complex, but lines of responsibility within banks and institutions are generally clearer, more established.
Right. There are compliance departments, procedures.
Exactly. With Bitcoin's radical decentralization, the responsibility lands much more squarely on the individual node operators. They need to be vigilant, proactive, filtering what comes onto their own machines.
Which raises a huge question for the whole community, doesn't it?
It really does. How do individuals, all operating independently in this decentralized system, collectively tackle this very real problem of harmful content? How do you do that while still holding on to the core principles, decentralization, censorship resistance, individual freedom that Bitcoin is built on?
It sounds like a very tricky balancing act.
It requires a really delicate, very thoughtful balance, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of a rethink about what neutrality actually means in the real world. In practice.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaway, the core revelation from our sources, seems pretty profound. Running a Bitcoin node is just not a simple, neutral, passive thing to do.
Not when you look closely.
While handling legitimate financial transactions, the reason the network exists seems ethically sound, aligned with its purpose. Our sources are crystal clear. Just blindly accepting any old arbitrary data carries unavoidable moral and, crucially, legal risks.
Big risks.
There's this fundamental line between being a neutral financial record keeper and potentially becoming a system where individuals unknowingly host and spread illicit content.
A critical distinction.
It really forces all of us to distinguish between the intended purpose of a network and its potential for abuse.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for you listening? Well, it encourages us to really think about the active role and the potentially serious consequences we take on, even when we think we're just passively participating in these decentralized networks.
And to sum up that key message from the sources, operators really must take active responsibility. That means filtering out harmful arbitrary content. If they don't, they risk both the moral burden and potentially severe legal trouble, maybe even just for unknowingly hosting illegal material.
Yeah,
This whole conversation, as the sources put it so well, it really happens right at the frontier where personal responsibility meets decentralized technology.
that's a powerful statement.
It really challenges us to reconsider what neutrality can realistically mean in an environment designed for maximum freedom and resistance to censorship. So, here's a final thought for you to mull over. As these decentralized technologies keep growing and changing, how do we as a collective make sure that individual autonomy doesn't accidentally become a loophole, a shield for causing harm? And maybe more personally, what role do you see yourself playing in shaping that future and making sure the promise of decentralization unfolds responsibly?
Those are powerful, vital questions for all of us as these technologies weave deeper into our lives. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, exploring these really complex but incredibly relevant issues. We really encourage you, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep thinking about your own role in this fast-evolving digital world.